La Declaración de Derechos Campesinos y otras
The Declaration of the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, in addition to being a strategic instrument for the recognition of peasants, their role, and their rights, is fundamentally a tool for thinking about, promoting, demanding, and building agrarian public policies, essentially in the sense of rethinking food systems, placing the rights of those who produce and those who consume at the center, and not the greed and profit of companies and corporations. In this sense, Article 16 of the Declaration is an important and central article in terms of discussing and proposing agrarian public policies, fundamentally because, let us remember, that this declaration is what the United Nations General Assembly itself recommends and establishes as guidelines for states when thinking about public policies in this sense. I am just going to read the first part, Article 16, which talks about the right to an adequate standard of living for peasant communities and their families, and that they should have access to the means of production necessary to obtain it. These include production tools, technical assistance, credit, insurance, and other financial services. Peasants also have the right to freely use, individually or collectively, in association with others, or as a community, traditional methods of agriculture, livestock, fishing, forestry, and to develop community marketing systems. Whenever we're going to study the Declaration, it is important that we can read this article in its entirety, because always after establishing the outlines of the rights, the Declaration sets out the obligations of the states, and that's what we have to focus on. Let's pay attention to the fact that this Article 16 is already proposing a fundamental role for the state, contrary to the whole neoliberal tendency that proposes that the state should not intervene in the market or in production systems. It is impossible to advance rights without struggles, but also without a state that intervenes and that guarantees an adequate standard of living for peasants. How to establish that adequate standard of living, what we would call a dignified life in the rural areas? Well, first of all, Article 16 says that the state must guarantee access to markets, and that is central. But for that, it also says that the state must guarantee tools. This has to do with machinery with appropriate technology for peasant agriculture. The state has to guarantee technical assistance, as well as the recognition of agroecology as a form of production. The same article vindicates it, and therefore the state has to guarantee technical assistance that guarantees this dialogue of knowledge that we peasants have been accumulating in terms of agroecology, but also of new scientific tools that allow us to improve our production systems and establish, if necessary, an agroecological transition. It also establishes as an obligation of the state the issue of credit. And let us remember that in most of the world, our communities have no access to financing. That is, to obtain credit, to sustain their working capital, to rethink their production system, to expand their production system. In this case, the state must guarantee an appropriate and accessible line of credit for women peasants. Then, there is the question of insurance, which is also important in the face of all that climate change is causing. We have storms, floods, droughts, hails. The state must establish fair and equitable agricultural insurance programs that allow peasants to be compensated when they suffer the consequences of climate change. Another very important element related to this article is the need and obligation for states to contribute to value addition. This means that in the rural communities themselves, establishments can be set up to process agricultural products in order to add value to them, to industrialize them at the local level, and that this profit remains in the hands of the peasant community. This is another very important element, in addition to the other factor that this article also raises, which is logistics, transport, and storage. That is to say, that the states must invest in order to guarantee that all these links in the chain are in the hands of the peasants. Logistics and transport, storage and processing facilities, so that peasants can easily reach the markets at fair prices.
Para que la producción campesina esté formalizada y entre de manera legal al circuito y no como pasa muchas veces que la normativa tiende a clandestinizar, a volver clandestina nuestra producción. Aquí la y es importante también establecer atención frente a la obligación de los precios justos.
Here, it is also important to pay attention to the obligation to guarantee fair prices. The article states that states must intervene in the market to guarantee fair reference prices, so that there is a fair price for the producer, but fundamentally, that there is an adequate price for the peasants.
Ingresos pueda obtener un nivel de vida adecuado que, como decíamos, es el elemento central de este artículo, ¿no? Ese nivel de vida adecuado también se puede complementar con otro elemento.
This adequate standard of living can also be complemented by another element raised in this article, which is fair wages.
En el marco del rol y el papel de servicio público que
when it comes to producing food for citizens, peasant women need to know that the state guarantees a fair and equitable wage, that the state guarantees a dignified life for peasants. Well, I think that in view of what we're discussing, the objective of this article is that peasants' rights are discussed within the framework of rural development, in order to establish sustainable production systems, vindicating agroecology, and of course, claiming a dignified life for peasants. Therefore, this Article 16 is very important when we discuss public policy programs, laws, resolutions, which make it a priority to support peasant production at the municipal, provincial, national, or even regional level, wherever this is possible.
ahí donde se permite.